Hi, welcome. My name is Eben Weitzman. I'm the Director of the Graduate Programs in Conflict Resolution in the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance here at the McCormick Graduate School of Policy and Global Studies. Can everybody repeat that back, please? What's that? Global Studies. Welcome, everyone, to our annual Sylvia and Benjamin Slomoff Lecture in Conflict Resolution. In a few moments, I'll tell you a little bit about this evening's event. But as many of you have already gathered, if you have been through us through any part of the day, we had a 3-hour-long workshop on dealing with mental health issues in mediation, led by our own Jean Cleary, who is hiding around here somewhere. Jean, where are you? She's hiding. Jean has been teaching our mediation course for years now and does an amazing job. And we had well over capacity in the workshop this afternoon, and that was wonderful. We've just had this very nice reception for David, and we're about to go into this evening's panel, the main event, and that's a tremendous amount of work. And making this happen does not happen just all by itself or just by accident or just because somebody says, hey, this is a good idea, let's do it. It happens because there's a tremendous amount of work put in, and we have a team in our department that does absolutely extraordinary work, and I want to thank them. Kelly Ward Mason is our lead on events, and she is assisted by Lee Murphy and now by Charlotte Namby, who's just joined us, and I'd like to ask all three of you to please come up here for a minute. Charlotte is the newest addition to our team. She's only been here for a couple of weeks, and she's already put in an amazing amount of effort.
Oh, thank you.
Thank
Here's my phone. Thank you so much.
And is this your phone?
Yes,
okay.
thank you.
And we just found the owner of the lost phone as well, so that was easy. Huge appreciation for our team. Thank you all. Thank you, thank you. We're joined, we have several important guests, important members of the UMass Boston community who are here with us tonight. I'll introduce in a moment. Provost Emily McDermott, Dean David Cash will speak as well. Before we get to that, I'd like to just talk a little bit about the Slomoff event and about Ben Slomoff and his family and friends who have made this all possible. Every year since 1999, we have hosted the Sylvia and Benjamin Slomoff Lecture in Conflict Resolution with the generous support of our alum, Ben Slomoff, who turned 105 last November. I spoke to Ben about 3 hours ago today, and as soon as he picked up the phone, before I even got, hi, Ben, how are you, out of my mouth, he was like, so how's it going today? What's going on? How many people are showing up? So anyway, Ben is on top of everything. Last year's speaker was Dr. Rima Saleh, one of the world's great advocates for the rights of children and women in armed conflict and post-conflict situations. She's been a member of the Secretary General's high-level panel on peace operations at the UN and a former deputy executive director of UNICEF. The Slomoff Lectureship has brought us some of the most well-known and influential people in our field, including Mort Deutsch, Herb Kelman, and Barbara Bunker, all social psychologists, Dennis Ross shortly after he left the State Department, John Marks of Search for Common Ground, Christiana Figueres, Executive Secretary of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, mediator and author Bernie Mayer, Professor Richard Hackman, one of the world's leading experts on teams, Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, and many more. So this has been an amazing event every year now since 1999. This year, I think, will be no different. So here's just a little bit that you need to know about Ben. Ben is one of the most inspiring people I've ever met. After high school, Ben went to work selling shoes. He left the shoe business to serve in the armed forces in World War II, and after a somewhat extended career in the armed forces, 14 years, he then went back to work selling shoes. He wound up owning a successful shoe company, which he ran for many years. After retirement, selling his shoe company, he came to UMass Boston for his bachelor's degree, and then his certificate, and then a master's in conflict resolution with us. Ben then went on to establish, in his 80s, a bustling mediation and arbitration career, until recently has been mediating and arbitrating several days a week, running multi-million-dollar cases, flying off to Hawaii and back and so on to manage all these cases. When I spoke to him a couple of months ago, he told me he's just finishing publication of his 4th book of poetry. He doesn't stop. And it's actually a rather painful example for the rest of us to try to figure out how to live up to. Told him we were celebrating David's 80th birthday today, and we get the sense that we're just getting started, right? Okay. We're joined today by Ben's grandsons, Adam Green and Brian Green, who make a point of joining us every year. And by the longtime family friend and another generous supporter of our program, Nancy Sonnabend. So thank you all for joining us. It means a lot. So this year we turn our attention to our own city of Boston, where recent years have seen an escalation of violent crime. We're joined this year by the Suffolk County District Attorney, Rachael Rollins, who will give the keynote address. She'll be followed by a panel of community activists, including Pastor Ray Hammond, pastor of the Bethel AME Church, chairman and co-founder of the 10-Point Coalition, and by Janet Connors, co-founder, an activist who helped change Massachusetts policy relating to victims of crime, and Christian White, community activist and founder of One Day at a Time. So this should be an extraordinary evening. Thank you all. To get us started and offer a couple of minutes reflection on the day's talk, I want to introduce our provost, Emily McDermott. Emily is a scholar of the classics and has stepped in to lead the university as provost through some interesting and changing times at the university, providing a steady hand on the tiller and helping us all to move forward. Emily, it's great to have you with us. Thank you very much for coming.
Welcome. Welcome to our beautiful campus on a better than average spring day. I've been at UMass Boston now for 45 years, and I grow prouder and prouder of it each year. I think we are, as you probably know, the public research university of Boston. We also boast of our teaching soul, and we boast of our unvarying commitment to social justice and to community-engaged scholarship. Right now, I believe we have 842 projects with 2,032 external organizations going to meet the needs of various communities, both locally, nationally, and internationally. We've won the Carnegie Community Engagement Classification, a coveted award, twice, most recently in 2015. But beyond being provost of a wonderful community-engaged research institution, I'm also the mother of 5 children and a grandmother of going on 10. This very morning, reading in the Globe about a grandmother killed in crossfire that was apparently aimed at her grandson, I was profoundly moved, thinking how fervently we all hope not only to protect our loved ones from senseless violence, but also to protect our children and grandchildren from the scarring personal circumstances and societal conditions that threaten to turn them into purveyors of senseless violence. I'm pleased to be welcoming District Attorney Rachael Rollins and panelists Reverend Ray Hammond, Janet Connors, and Christian White here this evening to further the vital dialogue about ways that our communities can reduce violence by addressing its root causes. Thank you.
I'd like to welcome the Dean of the McCormick School, David Cash, up to say a few words. David, welcome.
Thank you, Provost McDermott, for personalizing, because that's what so much of this is it's about. And thank you, Darren, and the crew from the department for pulling this together, and Professor Weitzman as well. It's always an honor to welcome folks to these always powerful conversations about very important topics. I'm the Dean of the McCormick Graduate School. You could see this is put on by our Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. We have master's degrees in conflict resolution and soon one launching in global governance and human security. They're PhD programs. We have sister departments of public policy and public affairs and gerontology, all of which take a look at these very complicated kinds of issues, dig into them in interdisciplinary kinds of ways, and seek real-world solutions to them. And this Slomoff lecture and the support of the Slomoff family, which has been so important, advances these kinds of conversations in such powerful ways. So thank you again, and thank you to the Slomoff family for all of your support. I'm really looking forward to this conversation today. I'm not a lawyer, but I have lawyers in my family, and I follow the law. I've been addicted to the Preet Bharara podcasts lately that take a very interesting angle on the law. And one of the things that he often talks about is the human dimension of the law, and not just of the victims and perpetrators of crime, but of the people, the lawyers, the judges, the people who are in the prisons and jails managing this incredibly difficult kind of conversation that has to go on. And I think what we're going to have today is that human dimension. I think one of the exciting things, as I have followed District Attorney Rachael Rollins' time, the short time that she's been here as District Attorney, is the human dimension that she brings to her work. It's not rote indictments, guilt and innocence, evidence, crime and punishment. There are human faces in all of the kind of issues. And again, I think Provost McDermott put that very plainly, reading a simple article today that could bring her into the space of pain and fear and optimism and hope. And I think that's what the kind of programs that we have here at McCormick bring. And I think that's what the kind of people that you'll hear today on our panel and from the District Attorney. So I'm very excited to be part of this conversation today. Thank you very much, and thank you, Chair Q.
Okay, let's get this started. My name is Darren Q, and I am Chair of the Department of Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. And I want to thank our campus leadership for coming. I want to thank the Slomoffs again for making this possible. I want to really thank Kelly, who really did the lion's share of making this event come together. If she hadn't done everything she has done, this would not happen. Lee, Charlotte, thanks to both of you as well. Let me just reiterate, you're going to hear some very interesting things here tonight. That our department engages many of these issues in conflict resolution, peace building, global governance, international relations. If you are interested in learning more about these issues, please do check out our programs, and our faculty are scattered around here tonight, myself, Eben, and others. We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. We're going to do a little bit of a different format tonight. As conflict resolution folks, we like to have different kinds of conversations rather than a typical question and answer. Unfortunately, though, District Attorney Rollins can only be here for a bit after her speech. So she'll be here, we'll give her speech, and then we're going to have the panelists are going to give their talk. And then after that, we're going to have a chance for you to talk amongst yourselves about some ideas that were bubbling in the conversation and to feed those ideas back to the panelists for a little bit of feedback. I'll explain the format more after District Attorney Rollins speaks in just a moment. I think that just looking back on Boston, there was a time, of course, where violence was quite high in Boston. And then through the actions of leaders in the community working with law enforcement led to a dramatic process in the late 1990s that had a real impact in bringing down the levels, particularly of crimes leading to murders across the greater Boston area. And Boston, for many years, had a fairly low rate of violent crime. Unfortunately, in 2016 and 2017, we saw those numbers increase dramatically. 2018, the numbers were down a little bit, but still higher than they have been in the past. So there has been quite a bit of talk in the media about this increase of violence in Boston. UMass Boston, of course, many of you know, lost a former coach that had worked here to violence just recently. My own family lost a family friend to violence in Boston last year. I think all of us are increasingly touched by this issue of violence in the greater Boston area. And I think the solutions certainly come out of the same magic formula of community leaders and every one of us working with law enforcement in new and creative ways to try to address this problem, see if we can get down to the roots of what's happening. So consequently, we are extremely privileged and grateful to have District Attorney Rachael Rollins here with us tonight to give her perspective on these issues. District Attorney Rollins is the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for Boston, Chelsea, Revere, and Winthrop. She's the first woman ever to be elected as District Attorney in Suffolk County. She is also the first woman of color to serve as Massachusetts District Attorney. Please join me in welcoming Rachael Rollins.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk for a little bit. I know he just explained to you the way he wanted it to work, but there's no way I'm going to speak until 7. So if I have that much time, I think I'm going to try to open it up to questions and see whether anyone wants to ask me anything or give me any input regarding what your suggestions are. So I'm supposed to talk about violence and why the uptick or how we are looking at combating violence. And I think people usually start by saying the community needs to step up. I'm not going to do that. I want to talk about why there is violence. And I think what we need to hear is about the incredible lack of services that some communities within Suffolk County have. So for example, if we look at housing and we look at, in particular, my detective Cecil, who's a wonderful man who works at the Boston Police Department, Marine Corps veteran, we were driving around here. UMass Boston is completely different than it was however many years ago. There's this huge, massive amount of growth, new buildings, et cetera. We see this all throughout Suffolk County. Overwhelmingly, the communities that I am being called into when my phone rings in the middle of the night about homicides that happen are in Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and Jamaica Plain, overwhelmingly. I chose the only person, by the way, that must live in Suffolk County out of all 300 of my employees is me. I must be a resident of Suffolk County, and I chose to move to Roxbury, not West Roxbury, but Roxbury, where the overwhelming majority, along with Dorchester, of the crime that my office prosecutes occurs. So with respect to housing, when we are talking about not only the gentrification of many of our neighborhoods, the fact that overwhelmingly black and brown communities, people can't afford to live there any longer. When we look at rents, those are for our quote-unquote law-abiding citizens. But let's talk about the fact that over 90% of the people that we send away as a result of engaging in criminal behavior return to us. And if they have a felony and their loved ones have a Section 8 voucher or are on public housing, there is an absolute bar as to that individual and where they can live. The individuals that are returning into the Seaport District, which, by the way, is where Mayor Walsh has his Office of Returning Citizens, which I talk to him about often, to say, if you are returning into the Seaport District and can afford a $3 million home, I don't necessarily think that you need our services as much as individuals that might be returning to Orchard Park or a housing authority in West Roxbury, which, by the way, there are housing authorities in West Roxbury. So I have been to them. So what I can tell you is we need to talk about housing, not just generally, but certainly for people that touch the criminal justice system. Where are they going to live? How are we going to there are 11 places in the United States that have programs where if you have a felony, you can live in public housing. Why aren't we one of them? If we're going to talk about violence and lack of services, it's not just housing, it's education. I recently testified in front of the legislature regarding the Promise Act, where we were fighting with Senator Sonia Chang Diaz to try to get $18,000 per student in overwhelmingly urban communities, poor communities, overwhelmingly students of color, black and brown students, and getting so much resistance with respect to that $18,000 that we are investing in hope, in promise, in education, and in opportunity. But you won't get a blink from anyone at the back end when we have $55,000 a year to house somebody in the Suffolk County House of Corrections, corrections officers being paid, tons of money through their unions, individuals profiting off of people's pain and sentencing. We need to look at education, and we need to invest much more. When you look at the number of corrections officers that there are to inmates, whether it's, let's say, 5 inmates to 1 corrections officer, let's juxtapose that to how many students per teacher in Boston Public Schools, right? 29, 30 students, sometimes even more, to 1 teacher. If we're going to talk about lack of services, it's not just housing, it's not just education, it's environment. When we look at our overwhelmingly urban communities, lack of green spaces that we have. We need to be proud. Mayor Walsh has done some wonderful things with respect to Boston as a place where I think it's something like you can't go 1 mile without a green park, and that's something we need to be proud of. But we need access to healthy foods in our community, right? We don't need to be a dumping ground for toxic waste, which when you look overwhelmingly in these urban communities, where are those dumping grounds? They're in our backyard. They're not out in these wealthy neighborhoods. So environment is important. We need to look at access to health care, right? And a lack of mental health treatment. If you've been reading the Globe over the last few months, there are so many doctors, there are so many psychiatrists and psychologists that are saying the insurance process is too overwhelming and ridiculous. I just take cash. So now with all of our mental health issues, you have to be wealthy to have a mental health issue. And let's not forget that, of course, if you are fairer skinned and engage in violence, you have a mental health issue. But the darker your pigment becomes, you become more violent and more of a terrorist for the exact same behavior. So what I can tell you is with access to health care, we look at disparities between white women and brown women, black women with respect to child care, and the fact that in 2019, black women are still dying to the tune of 3 times as many giving birth to a child, things that happen every single day. These are all real. Mental health is also incredibly important. When we look at where violence occurs in Suffolk County, there are entire swaths of neighborhood that are suffering from trauma, that are absolutely suffering from PTSD. And as I said to you earlier, when we don't have access to treatment for those significant mental health issues that you experience as a result of witnessing violence every day, that is a significant problem. A true story that occurred, I've been your DA or the DA for 4 months. There was a double shooting in Eggleston Square. One individual unfortunately passed, the other one lived. It happened in the middle of the afternoon, and when I showed up, the commissioner was already there. But I remember there was a school bus, that this happened right in front of a school bus. And my first question, as the mother of a 15-year-old and the guardian of 2 of my nieces, 10 and 6, that are both in DCF custody, I said, where is that bus? Where is that bus coming from? Are all those children going to get services? And if you think about this, and everything everything involves race in the criminal justice system, so let me just warn you of the next however many minutes I'm speaking about. But if you recall, there was an incident 12 months ago in some wealthy town where sadly 2 young girls were killed that were on the track team or the cross-country team. None of their high school teammates witnessed that horrific accident where they died, but that community rallied together, and the school was open, and psychologists and psychiatrists showed up, and the town shut down to make sure that people who might have even known these 2 individuals got the mental health treatment that they need. But I, as the DA, have to ask, where is the school bus coming from? Find out where all these students are. What is it about our community that people think that we should be used to this, or we deserve this type of treatment? This is where violence starts. All of those things coming together, all of those societal failures over and over and over again. Let's not even talk about we don't get to choose who we are born to, or as the aunt of 2 young girls with DCF involvement, and I'm also on the emergency list for the Department of Children and Families, so I get a phone call in the middle of the night if a family is in crisis and there are children in that home. It used to be that it was a violent crime that happened. Now, overwhelmingly, it's an overdose. And the children are there, and I get their children for that night. We need to think about what are we doing to help these young people? How are we thinking differently about all of these societal failures and what breeds violence? I can tell you that that is what breeds it. If we don't start correcting the societal breakdowns that we have, if we don't start demanding that our state and local systems work better and actually do the things that they're tasked with doing, we are going to continue to see violence. Absolutely. And remember, I, as your DA, I am the catch basin at the end of all of those failures that catches people before they go to jail. And why I proposed, if any of you know anything about me, which I love that my introduction was just, she's Rachael and I'm a woman and a brown person, which is my favorite 2 things about myself. But what I will tell you is I ran on a platform of 15 crimes that overwhelmingly clog up the system, that are committed by people with mental health issues, substance use disorder, or just because they are poor. That in the first instance, we are not going to send them directly to jail. We are going to pause and look at this individual as a person and look at the root cause of their problem. If we can divert them pre-arraignment, we will. If we can dismiss it outright because it's the first, second, or maybe even third time they've done it in the last couple of years, we will. But we will make sure they get the treatment they need for the root cause of what is bringing them to us. So I will say that is what I believe causes violence. And the next thing I want to talk about is, what is violence? How do we define violence? You know, you brought up obviously guns, and Kendrick Price was a tragic homicide that we had. Kendrick was also a graduate of my high school, Buckingham, Brown and Nichols, in addition to going to Michigan and doing all the wonderful things he did and being a coach here and other places. There's gun violence. There are other weapons that are, of course, used in violence. I've had 13 homicides since January 1st. Many of them involve guns, some of them don't. Some of them involve knives or stabbings. There are various ages of people. Of those 13, I would comfortably say maybe only 3 we could say strongly are gang involved, for lack of a better word. But in addition to guns and other weapons, there's violence against women. There's domestic violence that happens all the time. There's human trafficking. Sex and labor trafficking that overwhelmingly impacts women and immigrants. There are hate crimes. If you are not aware, the FBI in 2016 data, Massachusetts, #1 in hate crimes in the country. Now, this is a circumstance where data is deceptive, I think. I am proud of us that we are actually tabulating what hate crimes are as Massachusetts, because I'm sorry, Alabama and Kentucky, we know you're lying when you say there's 3 hate crimes that are happening down there. It's just that you don't consider things hate crimes when they obviously are, right? So I'm happy about this data, but we have to stand up when it comes to hate crimes, when we see what is occurring in the Jewish community with our brothers and sisters there, Muslim community, LGBTQI, and on basis of race. There is violence, I believe, when we are separating families because of their immigration status. That's trauma that people are experiencing. And whether you or I can agree on the separation as an act of violence or not, what I can assure you is the trauma that that mother or father or loved one or child experiences is going to manifest itself in some way. And then whether you believe it's violence here or there, it will result in some violent act. And I am incredibly proud that earlier today, along with the Middlesex District Attorney, CPCS, which is the public defender system in our Commonwealth, and the Chelsea Collaborative, we are the first state in the country that has filed a lawsuit against ICE to stop them from removing people from the public parts of courthouses. Period, end of story. So I stand here very, very excited about that. So that's what I believe causes violence. I also believe to solve violence, we need to look at these issues, but it has to be done at the same time. And I do believe we need to do a better job, and we being me now, law enforcement, which I laugh every morning when I say, wow, I'm a member of law enforcement, but I am. I have to be out in the community and explaining the work that we need to do as an office, apologizing candidly for some of the things we have done in the past, the way we have ignored and neglected and over-prosecuted and over-policed certain communities. When we make a mistake, we need to stand up and say that we have and not be ashamed of that, because mistakes happen, and then we need to be held accountable. So I have a lot of work to do, because there are entire communities that feel they are not interested in engaging in the process. And that's why we have over 1,000 unsolved homicides in Suffolk County. I'm not blaming the community because they don't trust the police or my office. We have to do a better job at making sure we are trustworthy, at making sure that we are seen in the community, not just when something happens, that we are present when good things happen and we speak out loud about them, that we are holding ourselves accountable and showing up and listening. And I think that is what makes me very different than many other people, not only the fact that I am a woman and a happily brown one, but I will tell you, we need to show up and we need to be very clear about the fact that we have a lot of work to do in our communities. And they are going to be shy about coming forward because they've been lied to before. And so it is a matter of continuously showing up. It is a matter of still being bold and strong when there are individuals, if we are not seeking bail any longer, that continue to make bad choices. Rather than focusing on that one outlier, I want to talk about the 97 or 98% of the people that aren't getting in trouble again, right? It's very interesting to me. The law is the one place, the criminal justice system, where people think when you get a progressive DA that my job is to stop crime. I would love to be able to do that, people, but that is not, I'm not capable. I'm good, I am not that good. Right? But an oncologist, when one of their patients dies, no one looks at that oncologist and says they are a terrible doctor. Death is part of the process. What you look at is the good work that is done. Now, of course, you must always look back and say, did we make a mistake here? Was there malpractice? Was there something we could have done differently? But somehow prosecutors are held to a different standard, or the criminal justice system is looked at differently. So those are the things and the points that I would like to focus on in shaping the conversation. I do want to make sure you understand that you are very, very lucky to have some of the people, at least two of them that I know personally on this panel. Reverend Ray Hammond, who is a leader in this work and somebody who has been actively involved, not only as a member of the clergy, but deeply involved in the community, living in the community, and assisting individuals that are facing really tough choices about decisions they're going to make, whether entering into high-risk behavior or not doing so. And then Christian White, who I've had the pleasure of meeting through my campaign and has been somebody who I've spoken with often about violence and its origins, and is a real success story of somebody who has absolutely touched the criminal justice system in many ways and is somebody who has turned his life around and is doing really important work with communities that are not interested in speaking to nerds, apologies, sir, right? Or people that read books about violence. They want to talk about somebody who's actually lived this experience and can look at them and say, I grew up on Humboldt Ave. I know exactly what you're talking about. And remember, in our lives, the generational changes are by decades, 10 years. In high-risk gang behavior, it's 3 years. Things change every 3 years. So Christian is even old, maybe. I mean, I'm really old, but he is somebody who they might even look at as somebody who might be a little out of touch. I can assure you he is not. But these are the things I'd love to have you guys think about before you start this evening. And if I could use maybe 5 or 10 minutes to open it up to questions if you have any of me, would you allow me? Thank you so much. And nerds are good things. I meant that in a good way. Does anyone have any questions? Okay. Am I allowed to? Let me start with Pink. I'm sorry.
Hi, Rachel.
Hi.
There's two things that sort of bother me about the system. One is I'm a survivor of homicide. My son was murdered. And I sat through a trial with a friend of mine. And prior to already having PTSD, I got it from sitting in the trial, looking at the autopsy photos. And it was just like, my advocate, what is the DA advocate supposed to do for you? Because it was like, I'm thinking, it wasn't even my trial, it was hers. Mm-hmm. But I went through so many terrible dreams and stuff, and it was like, why don't they offer health services for us after going through that? And also the teens that I speak to, they talk about how people get killed and the streets cleaned and people move on, but they have to walk by it every day. Like those blood stains, they still see those blood stains, even though everybody else goes on with their life. So when you made that point about other communities getting services, it's true. My grandkid's father was murdered 5 and 11, and they still haven't had counseling. So I try to mend what I know how to mend them, because I'm still struggling myself. But it's like they don't think about our grandkids and our children, and,
Sure.
And it's sad. And I thank you for everything that you said, because you weren't scared to say it, because it's real. And that's
I'm going to give you a quote. I ain't never scared.
I like
You know
that.
Ever.
I like that, and
Yeah.
that's why I voted for you, because we need somebody that's real and stop shading over stuff to make everybody think that they're so great. I like that you open those doors. Thank you.
And I want to just make sure that you know that I will be bringing these comments back. We have a new chief victim witness advocate that's actually a licensed clinical social worker. One of the things that we need to make sure people understand is victims of crime, we need to involve them more, right? What does accountability look like to you? The word justice is hard for me. I like accountability better, because there are some people with a homicide that say to me, do we have the death penalty? And I'll say, we do not in Massachusetts, in our state. Of course, we know that For example, in the horrific kidnapping and murder of Jassy Carrera, that was taken federally by our U.S. attorney, and that is death penalty eligible. So in the state of Massachusetts, there can be a death penalty, but only if the federal government takes it. There are other people with respect to homicides that say, I want this individual to serve a year for every year my loved one was alive, and their loved one was 22 years old, right? And they believe that is accountability or justice, right? But if I don't speak to them, if my office doesn't reach out to them about what they need, I wouldn't know that, right? I can't, of course I can say what I believe is the right response to a homicide that occurs, but that's actually not appropriate, right? I want to know what it is that they have to say back. Go ahead. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Today, the boy that murdered my son was sentenced. We went to court 2 weeks ago, and I've been in restorative justice. I've been going to Norfolk, doing circles with the guys, and it really changed the way I looked at the guy who murdered my son. And they kept saying, they kept stopping the case, because I said exactly what you said. That's why I'm tingling inside, because my son was 22. And I said that I wanted him to serve the amount of time that my son walked on this earth. And they had so much evidence against him, and they kept saying, are you sure you don't want to take him to trial? Because he can get life without parole. And I said, I don't want him to serve life, because I'm sitting with men in prison that have changed and do not have they can't go out into the community and help. So I didn't want that for him.
Yeah.
You know, so when you said that, because I was a part of restorative justice, it changed the way I looked at him.
Absolutely.
And even today, knowing that he went to jail, you don't understand the pain that I went through, because it was like, am I supposed to be happy? Because I wasn't happy.
Yeah.
My son's not coming back.
And I tell my staff all the time with homicides, this isn't a happy day, right? You know, we are honored to try to get accountability for you, and we are deeply saddened for your loss, but there's no winning side, right? Because someone lost their life, and this individual either made a decision or was in a circumstance where he believed he had to do what he did, and 22 years of his life is going to be gone now. So again, I will say that we are working with our victim witness advocates, thinking about great organizations like the Louis D. Brown Peace Institute that not only works with the families of survivors of homicide, but also actually speaks to the families of the defendants as well. And you know, they keep them sort of separate sometimes because we have to, but recognizing that when a homicide happens or a violent crime happens, there are two families that are impacted for the rest of their lives. You're right, this defendant's family, they're gonna maybe get to see their loved one again, and this family of the victim is never going to, but please understand both of these families are changed forever as a result of that. So thank you for sharing that, and again, I'm very sorry for your loss. Hi.
Thank you very much, Rachel, for your, very inspiring, this very inspiring moment. I come from Brazil. I come from the state of Rio, where last year the police killed 1,500 people. And, the majority, the absolute majority of these homicides are not cleared, so none of the policemen come to justice. I've worked a lot with women who have lost their children, and mainly women who have lost their children to, police violence. And what I wanted to know from you, you said that, most of the homicides, I don't know what is the percentage of the homicides which are not cleared by the police. So I wanted to know about the clearance rates in homicides, both homicides in general and and killings committed by the police. So I don't know how many killings there were last year. So how many killings there were in Massachusetts or in Boston. I would like to know. I don't have that data.
So let me talk, I can answer that. So clearance rates and homicides, if any of you read the Washington Post article in the last 6 to 12 months, sadly, Boston was number one, and not in a good way, with respect to clearance rates based on race. So right now in Boston, which is Suffolk County, Suffolk County is also Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere, but let's just focus on Boston. 90+% clear rate for white homicides, 42% clearance rate for black. I feel obligated to say out loud that homicides, if they are happening inside of a contained area, no homicide is easy to solve, but if it is in a room that is enclosed and we know that there were 4 people in that room, it's a contained site where we can get evidence, etc. Homicides that occur outside are a little harder to clear, right? So for example, we don't know where the shooting started. We start as big as we can and then make it as small as possible. But even with all of those distinctions, and I think the inference in the article was that white homicides might be happening indoors, whereas black homicides might not be. But I will tell you, what we can't get around is a 90+% clearance rate and a 42%. I will tell you there are less white homicides than there are black homicides, but I will also say I think that is a very important data point, where when I was running for office and I spoke in front of the Boston Police Detectives Association and was sort of strongly asked, like, are you saying that we're racist? And I said, I'm not saying anything. I'm saying we have data that show a huge disparity. What is your answer to that? Right? I'm just telling you what I read. Like, don't be mad that I read the Washington Post. I mean, you can read it too. But my point is simply clearance rates and homicides are very important. Another statistic that is not good with respect to the Boston Police, and I know they're working on this, is what is our clearance rate of non-fatal shootings, right? So if we only have a 15 or 20%, and I think that's high, clearance rate of non-fatal shootings, I want more resources and energy put there. Because what is a non-fatal shooting? To me, it's the precursor potentially to a homicide that we might be dealing with. And how are we looking at those with respect to, is this non-fatal shooting that happened 3 months prior to this homicide, are they related? Are they in some way the same? And then killings by police, I can tell you a very startling data point is that over 50% of them involve an individual in an active mental health crisis. So what we need is de-escalation training for our law enforcement officers. This is not my responsibility. I'm the DA, so I can control my prosecutors. I do have certain control over the homicide unit at the Boston Police Department and my State Police Detectives Association who handle those homicides. But we need mental health training. We need de-escalation training. And I am sad to say that, you know, I think the community justifiably questions why the DA's office that hand in hand walks into court every day with the police to prosecute our charges, why we investigate officer-involved shootings. And remember, the police, when an officer discharges his weapon, the police investigate themselves. The fitted team shows up and investigates a police officer that just discharged his or her weapon. What I did, ma'am, as the DA, was I created, for the first time, I think, in the country, a discharge integrity team that is completely outside of my office. It's a retired Superior Court judge. It is a member of my state police department. It is the former chief of homicide from my unit that's now a criminal defense attorney, and it is the head of a large health organization or health clinic in one of the communities that is most often impacted by violence. And she is also a survivor of homicide. And those 4 individuals and I meet outside of my office and are given all the data about what happened in this officer-involved shooting, because we had one February 22nd. And I will alone make the decision as to whether or not that shooting was reasonable or not. I can tell you that I feel compelled to say police officers have a very hard job. They really do. And situations can change in an instant. They can go from being seemingly innocuous to violent. And I want to make sure that I pay the respect there. But my job is to make sure that they, as the government, who can make a split decision that results in death without any oversight in that minute, I am here to tell them whether it was right or wrong. So we aren't going to be friends, right? We can be respectful to each other. But what's great is I don't try cases. I don't know any of them aside from the commissioner, who I speak with often. So I do think it's important to remove that function from the very DA's office that works hand in hand with them every day. And it has been, and I want to say this the right way. I don't believe in the last several decades, and I will check this, that an officer has ever been found to have been unreasonable or criminal charges were brought against an officer when they discharged their weapon and somebody died, right? Somebody was killed. And so that is either a great thing for law enforcement that they were reasonable in fact, but I can tell you there's a lot of people who question that, because of the closeness of the relationship. And what we have to do is be transparent and open the doors and explain to them how the process works so they can start believing that. I can tell you this is my first one. There have been 3, I believe, last year that were, or 2 to 3 that are still being investigated. I'm making sure we have to move faster too. It's completely unacceptable to me that it takes 18 to 24 months to investigate this. And a family and an officer are both waiting in the wings to see, am I cleared for what I did? Can I go back to my job? And a family finding out, was this person responsible for taking my son or daughter's life? Like, we have to be better and move quicker. I hope that answered your question. I'm talking too much. I can see your face. One more question, sure.
Thank you.
Oops, okay.
District Attorney, I have kind of 2 small questions
Sure.
for you. One, you were talking about social determinants of violence in communities. And I'm not naive to the fact that structural oppression, which drives the violence, much of it, is going anywhere anytime soon. But I'd like to know, what are your thoughts, and I'm making up a word, but around healing around communitarial trauma or intergenerational trauma in our communities, right? We get that, I get that I'm gonna die and structural oppression is still gonna very much be here. But is there anything that we can design and begin to implement within our own communities to make us more resilient and more whole against continuing to perpetuate this? As someone who's gone through my own journey of trauma, I found that the more I heal, the more my ability to cognitively reason and relate to people becomes healthier and better.
Yeah.
Question 1. Question 2 is, as someone who works in healthcare, and my particular company our CEO has started to drive us toward health equity, right? As the one young woman spoke about, the fact that in poor communities of color, trauma is not addressed. I can speak to that, witnessing that purpose.
Do you work at Blue Cross Blue Shield?
No, I work for Institute for Healthcare
All right,
Improvement.
good, because Blue Cross is pretty good too.
Yeah. If you could, wave a wand tomorrow, what would you want companies like mine that design and drive healthcare policy to work with the state of Massachusetts in doing?
Sure. So the first one is, healing around trauma. What I control is my office. That's where I want to focus immediately, and then look up and start being as loud as I can to other people. So I want to start hiring clinicians. I want to start hiring social workers. I don't only want my HR to be coming to me to say, like, we have more lawyers. Lawyers are great. I'm a lawyer. We are, in our municipal and district courts, we are triaging. We're the emergency room of the legal system, right? And no, I'm not gonna be giving someone a DSM-5 diagnosis in, the Roxbury Division of Boston Municipal Court, but I will say that if we can divert them to our office and have somebody from the Department of Mental Health there, in a perfect world, I would see different agencies coming into my building on certain days and me shoving people into my building to say, no, we are not going to arraign you, but next Tuesday or Thursday between 10 a.m. and 4 p.m., you have to come to our office and meet with this individual to find out what services we can get you. I think that's one way we can. And then additionally, I think restorative justice, the sort of circles that she talked about, I've been to one in Concord. I think I went to one in Concord. But I think there are ways that we can start speaking more about community involvement and the trauma that occurs when violence happens in our community. And so if I can be helpful with respect to those kind of circles happening, it's happening in a lot of Boston public schools right now. There are ways that we can be really helpful to see whether it's working. And then I have no problem if we see that something's working, let's do it more. If it isn't, how are we going to tweak it? And then there comes a point where it's like, okay, well, this isn't working, so let's think up some other solution. And with respect to healthcare and health equity, I find it unconscionable that even with DCF, the Department of Children and Families, there's a 6-month wait for children in the Department of Children and Families to get counseling. So, I mean, really? Like, that's unacceptable. Like, and we just need to be really loud. I get it. I sound like I'm an adjutant and I love fighting. And it's not that I love fighting. I'm just tired of nonsense. And I don't have time to say it nicely because we don't have enough time. So the Secretary of Health and Human Services, DCF has been failing for a really long time, and I can say this out loud as the guardian of 2 individuals that are in DCF custody, as a person on the emergency list for the Department of Children and Families. Oh, and by the way, as the foster parent of the year for the Malden office of the Department of Children and Families. I am fluent in this world, and it's not working well. So if we can't even help our most vulnerable of populations, how are we going to say, let's get health care for other people that aren't system involved, right? So what I think your CEO needs to do, we need to make things more available to people on Mass Health, right? So both of my nieces are on Mass Health because they're in DCF custody. And if that is a death sentence for them with respect to their mental health because nobody takes Mass Health, or there's a 6 to 12 month wait, unacceptable. And I don't want to wait for the next budget cycle to have this conversation. We need to talk about it now. Thank you.
Would you, it's your timing, we're working
Oh,
on
yeah,
your-
yeah, I can take another question. I thought you were forcing me out of here.
Well, one last
Okay,
question, and then
wonderful.
we'll
I'll
move
take
to our
one more.
panel.
I'm
Okay,
in.
great.
I'm in.
One last vote. You want to pick your question?
Ooh, yes, sir. You right there.
Hi. So I work for BPS. I'm a dean over at the Dearborn.
Great.
That's Roxbury, not West Roxbury.
The STEM Academy?
Yep, you were just there.
Wait. You mean the school that's on the cover of my memo? That one?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Yep.
I know you.
I'm in that photo,
I love
probably.
it. All right, go ahead. So we know each other. Go for it. What's up?
Yeah. So how is your office partnering with BPD and BPS to address safety issues around transportation to and from schools, especially around pre-tagged hotspot areas, geographic hotspot areas of, gang affiliate activity, Dudley being one of those spaces, which is also log jammed for BPS students who don't otherwise have services.
So that is something I will get information about. That is what I can tell you. One of the things I want to make sure we're doing is and a meeting I just recently had with BPS, which is not a pivot, I will get back to your point, is positive encounters with the DA's office. So for example, we're refurbishing our entire office. It's not me, it's our landlord. And we have no pictures on the walls, because the other thing I mandated was there will be no exhibits on the wall, which overwhelmingly are black and brown men engaging in criminal behavior. And even though those are real exhibits and things that helped us get guilty verdicts and accountability for families that were very often black and brown as well, we're not going to be you know what the word is, whatevering negative stereotypes, right? So reinforcing negative stereotypes. So what I can tell you is we're working with the Boston Public Schools to have in the elementary schools of those areas where a lot of the violence happens, what does peace look like to you? We're asking artists to draw pictures of that in the elementary school. What does community look like to you? And those are going to be the pictures that are lining the walls. We want to have a teen youth council for me, right? So our juvenile courts, we just raised the age from 7 to 12 of entry into the criminal justice system. Overwhelmingly, the people that are advising me are, older than me, right? Talking about juvenile issues that they might have experienced decades ago, right? So my point is just we want youth involved, and not only when we are arresting and prosecuting them, right? And that's sadly what our system does too well, is we only come in contact with them when we are FIOing them, right? Constantly, every day that they're walking home, just because they happen to live on a street, assuming that they're gang involved. So I will make sure that I have a conversation with Commissioner Gross about the geographic hotspot areas and what we are doing there. That was not an issue I was aware of. I appreciate you bringing it to my attention.
Please join me in thanking District Attorney Rachael Rollins.
I can come to you. Want me to come to you? Oh, I'm sorry. So what I was saying, ma'am, was just the state legislature just changed the law where young people used to be able to enter the criminal justice system at 7 years old. Now they changed the law that they enter at 12 years old. So I wasn't saying it's going to change, but that's when they can come into contact with the criminal justice system and the juvenile system as well.
Public Arts Academy and the Minez School, and I feel like the restorative justice circles should be implemented in all the schools, and not just starting with the middle school and the high school. This should start with the little kids, because they feel affected too, because they're losing their brothers or their sisters, their uncles, their dads, or and their grandparent. Unfortunately, the grandmother who was murdered in Mattapan. This is is there any way or a conversation that's being had about this being implemented into schools?
Yeah, so I just met with the acting superintendent of schools for Boston Public Schools and talked about that. I think that's something absolutely that I can be more vocal about. And I think, restorative justice is so helpful because it allows us to learn how to talk to people without becoming, escalating immediately, right? And I think as young people, it's very rare, I know certainly growing up in my house, where we had calm conversations with people that didn't immediately escalate into, I'm not saying necessarily violence, but yelling and other things. And that is something I can absolutely do. I know we're going to be getting a new school superintendent soon, but I can continue working with them and seeing about advocating for them to implement that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you again. Okay, if I can invite our panelists to come up while I'm going to introduce you, all three of you, quickly. So just a quick reminder, we're going to have our panelists are also going to weigh in on this issue. And then we are going to get a chance for you to have a quick conversation in small groups at each of your tables. And then we'll come back and have some final questions and round up for the night. Okay, I'm pleased and honored to be able to introduce three, I think, stellar panelists that can really help us understand these issues so much better. Beginning with Reverend Ray Hammond, who is a pastor of Bethel AME Church in Boston. He has a long history of involvement with youth and community activities, and he is chairman and co-founder of the 10-Point Coalition, which mobilizes people regarding issues affecting high-risk youth. Janet Connors is a social justice activist with 50 years of experience working with youth and families in Boston. After losing her son to homicide in 2001, she helped change Massachusetts policy relating to victims of crime, allowing them the option of engaging in victim-offender dialogue. And lastly, Christian White is a community activist and founder of the One Day at a Time Dad, an organization that assists incarcerated and returning individuals in supporting their children and families. He uses his experience as a former gang member to guide young people toward a different path. So I'm going to invite the panelists each to speak for 10 minutes, and then I'm going to briefly after each talk ask a quick follow-up question and give them another minute or two to elaborate on points that they make in their conversation. Okay, and then we'll have our small group conversations, as I mentioned. So I'd like to begin with Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond. Pastor Hammond, please.
I was trying to defer to my other colleagues here and maybe fill in some holes at the end of it. One, I want to say thank you to Darren for this invitation and to the center as well as to UMass. And just applaud the fact that this is a university that I believe is really working hard to figure out not just how to analyze and understand things, but how do we actually use that information in a way that can make a difference. And that really needs to be applauded in this day when so much emphasis goes on the analysis and often too few resources into the actual solution. It's hard to know kind of where to begin, but let me just say a couple of things. I think the points that were raised by the district attorney, Rollins, were powerful and very important. We're looking at the things that I think are not only curative in the sense of really making a difference when it comes to violence, but preventative. And both of those wings of the problem are very important. The challenge, of course, is that these are big changes, huge changes. And the question in part is, as we are working on those things, as we're advocating for the kind of housing that people need to lead decent lives, as we're working on changing an educational system that really doesn't work very well for a very large number of people. And the poorer you are and the dark you are, the less well it works for you. As we're working on the huge changes that we need in our healthcare system, which is extraordinarily good at delivering Cadillac care to the few, incredibly poor at delivering the kind of comprehensive and effective care that the many need. And so all of these things we've got to keep working on, and we haven't got to the whole issue of mental health, the stigma we've got to get past, the issues in terms of transparency, the number of people we need to train, and particularly when we're talking about good people who can work in the adolescent and young adult arena. So I absolutely subscribe to that, advocate for it, work for it. In part, we're sort of asking, as we're working on these huge issues, what can we also do to save lives? What can we do to make communities safer, more secure? What can we do to reduce this exposure of young people very early in their lives to trauma and the impact that that carries out over a lifetime? This work for me began really back in the late 80s. And it was a response to what was happening across the nation. And that was a major increase in the 1980s in crime. And there's multiple analyses about why that happened and so on. And I won't go into all that, other than to say that I think across the country people were deeply concerned. In Boston, we tried to ask the question, how can the community itself begin to play a bigger role? And for me particularly, the question was those institutions that are in the community, and one of them that I'm very deeply involved with is the church. And over time, other communities of worship and faith. How can they play a bigger and more important role in that? And so I just want to quickly tell you kind of the process that we went through and are still in the process of going through. The first was to say, how can we better reach that generation of young people who are caught up in the violence, who are both victims and perpetrators, who have found themselves for all kinds of reasons essentially caught up in a war zone with very interesting rules, a war zone that literally takes no prisoners, and where what appear to be the rewards of the system are incredibly illusory. So it turns out that if you do some of the work that Professor Elijah Anderson did, it turns out that most people, for example, in the drug trade, never end up making more than minimum wage. But you don't know that going in. And by the time you figure it out, your opportunities have closed down significantly. And so part of the question was, how do we get to young people and begin to help them see some of those realities and see another pathway out? Lots of people did many things. You perhaps heard about some of them: Operation Ceasefire, Operation Nightlight, all kinds of community and police collaborations. And in Boston, I think as a consequence of that and many other things, the street workers program, new approaches to probation, in the 90s, we saw among major cities the greatest decrease in crime. And that was great. Even when the new millennium began, I think many of us were saying, okay, we know how to do that, but we've still got a fairly constant level that never dips below 35 homicides a year. What do we do about that? That led, I think, in the next instance to saying, not only do we need to ask that question, we need to be asking ourselves the kind of questions this center is. How might we mediate disputes? How might we resolve conflicts before they escalate to the level of violence? And in the case of the group I was working with, that was part of a whole mediation process. And it's fascinating being here because our first mediation was held at the John F. Kennedy Library. And the reason for that was very simple. It was very close to the two groups that we needed to mediate. They all knew how to get here. And the library availed itself. They said, we're trying to look for opportunities to be more responsive to the community. I happened to be in a conversation with the director of the library. He said, why don't you hold the mediation here? And that's where that first mediation was held. That was also looked at by Northeastern University, the Kennedy School, and you can show that if people are willing to step up and be mediators, to be peacemakers, you can reduce nonviolent shootings and you can reduce homicides by at least 20 to 30 to 35%. At this point, we know that works. We know that those other interventions work. But I'm still deeply troubled because I'm asking myself, what else do we need to do to bring that level that we're all have learned to live with down further? And I think increasingly we're all asking the question, not just how do we go after the individual young people, but what could we do to make neighborhoods different? And most importantly, how could we better reach that 50% of that 5% of families connected to 50% of the crime? Now, we know law enforcement knows about them. We know that our healthcare, our State and other systems know about those families, but by and large, they interact with those families for the purposes of either delivering services or, in many instances, kind of policing them. What if, in fact, we had a different view that said, these are families who are in deep distress, and it is very much in their interest and in ours to figure out how we break that multi-generational cycle of distress. So those are the kinds of things we're trying to look at and work through. The last thing I'll say is that some of you may have run across a book by a fellow named Steven Pinker called The Better Angels of Our Nature. And he offers a view that violence is actually getting better. It's been hugely controversial, but I subscribe to it. And I subscribe to it not because that means to me that we need to stop doing the things we're doing. I subscribe to it because I think the evidence supports it, and secondly, because it gives me hope. It says that if as a community we make this important, if we really care about the people who are involved, if we stop looking at folks and the problem as a statistical one and understand that it is deeply human, that in fact we can make progress. And working toward that progress and the commitment to see that progress made is part of what gets me up every day. And so I just want to offer those thoughts. I'm happy to pursue that some more with you as the audience as we all talk together about what we can do, both to go after the big issues that will ultimately, as I say, I think both cure and prevent it, and in the meantime, not allow the body count to continue to rise. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, thank you, Reverend Hammond. Maybe if you would take just one more minute on your point about the importance of mediation locally. I'm wondering if you might connect it a little bit to your point about trying to reach the younger generation better. Is there something different about mediation we need to be doing now to get at that 5% of the families that you're talking about? Is there something you've mentioned? We've got some tried and true methods that can lower things 25 to 35%. Should there be something new or additional with the mediation approach that's been done in the past that you think needs to be done today?
I don't know that anything new needs to be done. I think it's a matter of scale. I think part of the problem is we're tending to apply it because the resources we have are scarce. Trained mediators and mediators who have credibility and connection, those numbers are relatively few. So you end up concentrating them in the crisis areas when really, ideally, you want to get to things earlier and earlier and earlier in the process. You don't want to wait till they're at the point where it's really clear we got a problem. So, because that means you're going to miss things that are going on. So I think the problem is one of scale, frankly. I think it's also a matter of location. One of the issues we're trying now to look at is how do we locate that in schools, for example, in high schools? How do we begin to train young people to take really take the lead there? So it isn't just street workers or case workers coming in, but young people themselves have these skills, have the sense of confidence in their leadership to really change the outcomes for their peers. So I think it's both an issue of figuring out how we get to scale and how we begin to mobilize this in the population I think that's most important, and that's young people themselves.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Christian, please.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Darren. First of all, this is an amazing opportunity for me on many levels. So, first of all, y'all know him as pastor, but this is my uncle. And many times when he would sit side by side with me, oh, thank you, birthday, sir. So many times when he would be by my side, it would typically be at either Roxbury District Court or Suffolk Superior Courthouse. So this is a restorative circle moment for me personally. So the last and final time that I went to prison was in 2006. I was sentenced to 10 years for possession of a firearm without a license to carry. I served just about 9 years of that. When I went inside, my son's mother was 8.5 months pregnant, and when I came home, he was turning 9. I saw him twice as an infant. He was 7 days and 10 days old, and then I saw him twice back-to-back days in 2009 when he was 2 years old. He's now 12. I've been home 4 years successfully, maintaining everything that's expected of me. Above and beyond that, I'm now a single dad. I have full custody of him, which inspired the work that I'll get into soon enough. But I just want to give a little overview of myself to tie in why I feel what everybody was talking about, from the district attorney to my uncle, and I'll hear from Janet after, is the role that mental health plays. And the role that mental health plays, the earliest and earliest and earliest of possibilities we can implement it into these kids' lives. So I grew up under, I won't use the word horrendous, but certainly unpredictable but very predictable circumstances. I experienced every sort of abuse you could imagine, from sexual to physical to neglect to whatever have you. And this went on from about the ages of 3.5 to about 13. And these would be constant abuses. So this was the beginning of what was shaping my mind long before I ever found myself on either side of a trigger. I didn't actually become involved with the gang world until I was 13. At 13, my dad, he sat me down and he said, "Christian, I can't afford you anymore. You have to leave." I had no clue what I would do. I was given the option of either moving in with my biological mother, whom I met just a month prior to that. She had given me up when I was born. I was the 5th of 5, and she was 17 when she had me. So you do the math. So she was obviously in no way, shape, or form able to take care of the first 4, so the 5 definitely wasn't going to get a pass. So the second option was to move in with my Uncle Ray and Aunt Gloria, whom happened to live in Roxbury near Humboldt Ave. When I moved in with them, it was such a culture shock for me that within 6 months, at this time it was DSS, I asked the court to put a chins on me so I could go into foster care or a residential home because I needed some dysfunction in my everyday life. They were offering me pure love. I couldn't do with that because that meant being open and vulnerable and accepting love from sources that weren't trying to use you at the moment. And I didn't want that love. I wanted the love that would use me and discard me. So there was a place for that. And it was Humboldt Ave. And it gave me everything that I ever wanted, the acceptance, the love as I understood it, and I ran with it. I did the best to my ability that I could while in those streets to prove that I needed to be loved and was worthy of love more than any other person out in that gang life. But the point of that is so many people would say to me, "Christian, you moved in with your uncle and aunt. They have 2 daughters that are going to the Windsor School. You could be going to the equivalent of that of a boys' school. You could be," and what people don't take into consideration so often is our children's backstories. These kids are coming from situations where it's literally they have to make a choice, and it can be the difference between 3 years or 10 years. And that is in a prison cell. And so, that's sort of the history of where I came from. And this last and final time that I served, it wasn't the first. It was the 3rd of a state sentence, and I've done 3 county sentences, and I've awaited trial for multiple crimes in and out that time. And in some ways, I loved being inside more than outside because it offered that structure that I never had. It offered routine that I craved. but I turned that around, and here's a little bit of how I did it. For me personally, I've been a mental health advocate probably since about the age of 18, which is when I first revealed the sexual abuse to my aunt, his wife. I wrote her a letter from Shirley Max, which is Susan Baranowski, and this was just when it was built, and I told her everything that had happened to me because I had happened to hear a story amongst my family that really made me realize that maybe this was having an impact on my everyday decision making. Because prior to this, you don't know words like PTSD, anxiety, you have no reason to. It's not real. Only what's in front of your face and the choice you need to make is real. And in these days and times, everything was survival. There was no words like future or legacy. There was no need for them. So to move on, 3 significant things happened during this last and final sentence. The first was, I continued addressing my mental health issues. In prison, it's a no-no that they help you address any sort of trauma work. It's an unwritten rule because in their mind, they don't want you walking around raw, when the reality is you were raw from the moment you walked in there. But I learned the verbiage and the words and the jargon, and I figured out how to ask the best questions that would net the best results. So whenever I found myself in a room with a clinician who usually asked me 2 things, are you gonna hurt yourself or others? No, okay, then you're mentally sane. I learned how to talk to them and force them to talk to me and give me the strategies that I needed to turn myself around. Alongside having support systems that were there for me, even when probably nobody should have been there. The second thing, and excuse me, was I realized that my son did not ask to be here and that he needed me because I knew what it was like not to have a father that was there to the capacity that they should be to see that their child had become successful. And I don't blame my father anymore or my mother. I am pretty sure they did the best with the hands they were dealt. I believe that. But I started deciding that I was gonna question not just where my cards came from, but who dealt them, who hired this dealer, who manufactured these goddamn cards, because I need to know all of these things. And I passed this on to my son. The third thing that was very significant, and it didn't occur to me until this was all within the 6th year of the 10-year sentence. I realized that serving my prison time was in and of itself insufficient to hold me accountable to my community. It wasn't good enough, and I don't care how much time I served. I could never serve the amount of time possible that it would take for me to take back the things that I've done in my neighborhood. So I owe my neighborhood a debt, a lifetime debt, to help make it better, because there's still 3-4 generations of kids that are still inspired by who they think I used to be. And I have a job to help change that perspective. And in come the one day at a time dad. So I'm now 40 years old. The one day at a time dad began when my son moved in, which was December 2017. I started a Facebook page because I needed to learn how to be a dad. I didn't know how to be one. So I was asking any and everybody for suggestions and ideas. And my son's on the autism spectrum. He's diagnosed with PDD, NOS, pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified. So that just added in a whole nother element of things I needed to get caught up on instantly in order to provide and be the best advocate I could be for my son. And the first way that I decided to do that was, is when I came home, I realized that I couldn't be a father first. I had to respect the person my son was. I had to respect my son before I could ever father him. Because so many times, like my dad and other dads, they come home and they treat the household like the way the CO treats the cell block. And that's not what's gonna bring healing. I decided that I needed to be open-minded. I needed to continue to hold myself accountable and continue to recognize I had a duty to be the best father and advocate for him and the best person I could be for my community. So I started a poster campaign in Boston, Springfield, Chelsea, Lawrence, Lowell, and Lynn, and I hung up thousands of signs. I drove around, spent days doing it, that said, if you go to jail, will the gang raise your child? I would hang these everywhere. And people would say, well, why is there that sign hanging on the stop sign in back of Stop and Shops where nobody hangs out? Because I know that's where the people I want to reach, I know that that's where they are. And so what I do is, first and foremost, and it's my form of restorative justice, but it's actually going and talking to these young people and asking them what is wrong. You'd be surprised how much information you can net just by walking into that hotspot you may be fearful of and just asking a young person, how are you doing? And I realized by doing this, it began to raise their self-value. And that is something that I lacked. So I'm hoping to open a nonprofit, the One Day at a Time Dad, and the focus will be for returning citizens, for men specifically, because we all know that it's typically men who are out here doing the killing. And I want them to come, and it'll be like a Returning Citizens Anonymous. They will be able to come and talk, because the one thing that I have issues with is I can't really be personal with people. I can't talk to the streets because that's too close and anything can happen. I can't talk to my colleagues at my workplace because they don't have my experience. So I want to set up a stage where men can talk about what they're going through on a daily basis, because for people like me who have never lived a legitimate life and now are 100% legitimate, every stage is a transition for me. And I need constant knowledge and support as I do it. And also, I'll be holding focus groups for families with children with disabilities, because so many men, especially in my neighborhood, and I'll leave it there and let you have a question or two when you have them.
Thank you, Christian. I didn't mean to cut you off in mid-sentence.
Hey, I get it. I'm learning this world. Trust me.
If I'd like to give you one more minute, if you would, and it's a question you need more than a minute to answer. But when you talk to young people, when you're asking them, you say, "What is wrong?" Mm-hmm. What do they tell you? I mean, and just maybe one or two main things you keep hearing from young people that this audience should be thinking about. When you ask young people, what is wrong? What are the one or two or three main things you keep hearing from them as to what is wrong?
When I ask them what is wrong, the number one thing, if I had to think of it, is they really believe that nobody cares about them. And I don't care how old they are, because I went to prison at 27 and still had the mentality I had when I was 13. That's the number one thing. What I find is everybody tells you what you need to do to help fix them. So the longer I sit and I also run a page on Facebook called Listening to Learn, where I interview individuals from all backgrounds about their backstory and show the commonalities of us all. Because the same way most of y'all have probably never lived my life, and I'll do this in 10 seconds, the way that most of y'all have probably never lived my life, your life still became normal for you. The same way my life became normal for me. So just remember that. We grow up, all behavior is learned. We need to be active in people's lives to help them learn new behaviors.
Hello, everybody. Well, he's young to me. He's 37. My young friend, Iraq Ernesto Montana Arroyo, just sent me something today that said, peacemaking doesn't mean passivity. It is the act of interrupting injustice without mirroring injustice. The act of disarming evil without destroying the evildoer. The act of finding a third way that is neither fight nor flight, but the careful, arduous pursuit of reconciliation and justice. It is about a revolution of love that is big enough to set both the oppressed and the oppressor free. And he didn't know the source, but I told him that it was very timely that I was coming to be on a panel with Christian and Reverend Hammond, and he said, Reverend Raymond, Reverend Gloria, or Reverend Mariama? So I'm happy to be here with all of you. And you, some of what you said brought something up for me, because when my son was killed, there were 4 young men involved, and 3 of them went to prison with plea arrangements, and the young man who actually killed my son, Joel, went to trial and beat his case. But at the very same time, my neighbor's son and his co-defendant, who were friends with my son, who are Cape Verdean and African American, were sentenced to life without parole for a murder they did not commit. The conviction was overturned over 1.5 years ago, and they still sit in jail. They were young fathers who were stepping up to the plate. So they are 2 young black men whose kids were 2 years old when they went to prison, whose kids are now 20 and 21 years old. And they would have been there for their kids. And my neighbor and I are really good friends. Our kids were friends. Our kids still are friends. My daughter lives in Louisiana. She doesn't come up to visit and not go and see Tanzarius in prison. Never. She always makes that a priority in her visit. And I just knew I had to make my own justice. Because the young man who killed my son beat his case. The young man who actually killed my son beat his case. He went to trial and beat his case. But I worked on Bowdoin Street. I've lived in Dorchester all my life. I worked on Bowdoin Street in the 80s and 90s. I worked on Bowdoin Street for 19 years. And I saw a lot of young kids grow up and do good things. I saw a lot of young people going in and out of prison and DYS lockup, and knowing it wasn't doing any good, coming out, fronting a little bit harder, acting a little bit tougher, knowing a little bit more about how to be a criminal. And I went to several funerals and then wound up at my own son's funeral. And I am not college educated. I came up as a consumer of services, as a single mother myself. But as someone who worked with kids and families all my life, I had to ask myself, where have we failed these young people that they get to a point where they kill one another? Where have we as parents, as educators, as social workers, as clergy, as neighbors, where have we failed these young people that they can get to a place where they kill one another? And I remember before the arrests were made that I wrote in my journal, who are these monsters? And a couple of days later I went in and I read that, and then I went and I wrote, we're not looking for monsters. We're looking for other young people. And if I think of them as monsters, I actually let them off the hook. Because monsters are just doing what monsters do. Monsters hurt people. But if I hold them in their humanity, then I hold them accountable. And the word accountable has come up here many times. And it's really true. You can serve 40, 50, 60 years in prison and never own your stuff. Because punishment is imposed. It comes down upon you. Accountability rises up from within. It comes from the heart and soul. It's much harder to search your soul and own your accountability. And I'm not saying prison is a breeze, but it is much, much easier. It is much, much harder, rather, to really search your soul and to really own your accountability. There is a lot of work being done in schools. I'm a trainer for the Center for Restorative Justice at Suffolk University and have done work in schools So they're training a lot of people. There's 30 schools on a National Institute for Justice school that are having with implementation coaches. The BTU is working on restorative justice. The people at the Bowling Building are working on restorative justice schools as alternatives to suspensions, but also to hold circles before there's an incident, to hold circles, to build community, to build relationships. There's an alternative school in which circles became, of 60 kids, circles became so much a part of their curriculum and their programming that for 2 years in a row, they had only 2 incidences of student-to-student conflict and 0 suspensions. In schools, there are some schools where they, not only in Boston but across the country, where they have started actually only holding circles with staff. And in the first year, suspension rates have gone down 60, 70, 80% just from holding the circles with staff. So people like to think, well, sometimes people think that restorative justice is case-specific or incident-specific. But I like to broaden the idea to community, because we're shifting from thinking about crime to thinking about harm. And how do we repair harm? There are mothers sitting over there, my sisters from Legacy Lives On. There's a couple of tables of them. We are survivors of homicide victims. We've lost our sons, our grandsons. We've gone into schools and we've sat with young people who are dancing with a foot in both worlds, coming to school but hanging out with some of the gangs. At one school that Shamice talked about when she was addressing Rachael Rollins, we were there for a year and a half. We saw those young people having weekly circles go from saying things like, revenge is my justice. Well, I won't go out looking for it, but if it comes up on me, I gotta do something about it. And finally, we started hearing stories of them walking away. I walked away the other day. I watched my back, but I walked away the other day. We began in the first meetings and circles with them. There was a lot of discussion about, I'd rather my mother visit me in prison than visit me at the grave. I'd rather my mother visit me in prison than visit me at the grave. Mm-hmm. And finally, over time, those young people started saying, no, you know what? I want to go to college. I want my mother to visit me in college. I want my mother to visit me when I'm old enough to have my own apartment. I want to invite her to my apartment. So if we use these circles to build relationships, to build community, and we will sit, any one of these mothers, and there's more, will sit with young people and do this work. Because we know that as huge as our individual losses, the loss to community is even greater. That every time one of our young people is incarcerated, shot and hurt, or stabbed and hurt, or killed, or deported, there's a hole in the fabric of our community, and that we frantically try and sew up those holes. Shamice, I will never forget this, in one of those circles, she unfolded a box. We were told to bring in a special object. She unfolded a box. She had it tied in a ribbon. She untied the ribbon, and she pulled out pictures and mementos of her son. And she said to these other young men, this is what I have left of my son. Mm. Do you want this to be what your mother has left of your son? You don't want your mother sitting with her where we're sitting. Shamice also said to them one day, you're my justice. coming here every week and seeing you here, that's my justice. I'm not hearing from somebody that you've been killed. You're here, you're going to school, you don't have to be here, but you are coming here. That's my justice. Merveline Chambers, whose son Ivo Brown was killed, whose case has never been solved, she said, justice really isn't about catching somebody who killed Ivo. Justice for me is that we create a world where our kids are not incarcerated, where our kids are not killing one another, where our kids know about a just world. I had the DA in my situation, and I've recently heard 2 members from the DA's office in circles at Norfolk Prison say, law is for this world, justice is for the next. Well, in some ways, that's what satisfied me, is I knew that you can't get away with murder and that someday the young man who killed my son would face a power higher than anyone in this court. But I want a just world now. I want a just world. I want to work towards a just world. So what if there were circles in all neighborhoods? What if in every housing development people were running circles? And not professionals running circles. I don't care if you have a GED, no GED, or a PhD. If you live in this neighborhood, you can hold a circle. And you can build community and build relationships. And then if something happens, there's a true and genuine community response. And also, if you see a kid or a family struggling, you can circle up around them. There's a tribe in the Congo called Babimba, where when someone does something wrong, the whole village stops. That person, they sit in a circle, that person's put in the middle of the circle, and one by one, everybody recounts a positive deed, talent, or characteristic that this person has done. The idea being to remember them, not only in the memory of the stories, but to remember them back into alignment with the standards and values of the community. That's what circles and restorative practices are about. Instead of pushing people out, instead of kicking kids out of school, kicking them out of the after school, instead of suspending kids, instead of expelling kids, instead of locking people up and throwing away the key, restorative practices and circles are about bringing people back in, understanding that everybody in the community has value to contribute, and helping them to know what their value is.
Thank you, Janet. One quick follow-up question, if I may. I'd actually just like you to continue on your last thought a little bit about your vision for where circles can be used in the community. I'm hearing, particularly in the school system, a role for circles. I'm thinking about, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your thoughts about other venues for the use of circles in the community, perhaps for other types of crime or other types of problems that may pop up. Would you take a minute more and tell us a little bit more?
Well, like I said, I think neighborhoods, if people had circles in neighborhoods, if some of the community centers had circles, every housing development has a community room, all of those places are places where circles can happen. There's also a lot of harm in circles, a lot of harm that happens even between activists themselves. So using circles and restorative practices to resolve some of the conflicts between activists themselves is one thing that is happening. It is actually happening. There's been a tremendous influx of requests for sexual assault, circles around sexual assault, between people who don't want to villainize somebody, as this saying that Iraq sent me says, that understands that we need to understand each other better. So I think that there could be circles, circles everywhere. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Can I sing a song?
Please, go ahead.
I'm gonna sing our song, okay? The higher you build your barriers, the taller I become. The further you take my rights away, the faster I will run. You can deny me, you can decide to turn your face away. No matter, 'cause there's something inside so strong. I know that we can make it, though you're doing us wrong, so wrong. You thought that our pride was gone. Oh no, something inside so strong. The more you refuse to hear my voice, the louder I will sing. You hide behind walls of Jericho. Those walls will come tumbling. Deny my space in time. You squander wealth that's mine. My light will shine so brightly it will blind you. Because there's something inside so strong. I know that we can make it, though you're doing us wrong, so wrong. You thought that our pride was gone. Oh no, something inside so strong. Brothers and sisters, when they insist we're just not good enough, but we know better, just look them in the eyes and say, we're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna do it anyway. We're gonna do it anyway, because there's something inside so strong. I know that we can make it, though you're doing us wrong, so wrong. You thought that our pride was gone. Oh no, something inside so strong. Something inside so strong.
I think that answers my question. Thank you. It's a real privilege to have such just an amazing panel up here who are so deeply engaged in these issues. I know we're going on a little bit late just because, when the DA needs more time, you give the DA more time. So, but I do want to give us a chance for you all to have a few minutes to think about everything you've heard and to give some questions back. I know we have a class that's got to leave in the next few minutes, so we're going to lose a couple of you. But for those of you who have still been here, if you want to just take maybe just another 10 minutes so we can at least get some questions back to the panelists. And I want to acknowledge, first and foremost, as Janet did, Legacy Lives On. Can I just ask you to hold your arms up again? So, thank you. So since we are running low on time, I don't think we have time to go through the sort of the small circle process I had wanted to, since we're going to lose a lot of folks. And I think we have a small enough group left here to be able to at least have the conversation as one large group. But I would like you to I'd like you to at least acknowledge Legacy Lives On. As Janet says, these folks who are survivors of violence in the community and have turned it towards restorative justice and reconciliation activities. They are real resources for this conversation. I hope when we finish, you'll go over and maybe introduce yourself to some of these folks, and I'd like to introduce you as well to many of the folks here. So before you go, thank you so much for coming. So. If we would, I'd like to open the floor to some questions, either for the panelists or some ideas you might have on what we could be doing. Tony, can I give you the mic? So, oh, great, thank you.
Tony, I know.
Thank you. So I wanted to give my question to Janet, considering her history of work in the restorative justice community and a lot of the work she's done. When you look at the question around circles, restorative justice circles that they're having in prison, in communities and so forth, what do you see as an obstacle in terms of those processes, and what ideas and solutions do you think could sort of help that, particularly when you're dealing with institutions that have power, and institutions that have power that are repressive, in fact, sometimes even more criminal than the people who they say are criminals. What do you see as those obstacles and solutions to try to bring the principles around restorative justice in the process of trying to create circles to deal with issues and conflicts and so forth, and to be able to move on? So, you know, as a practitioner, I'm just trying to see what you really see as that.
Well, is it on? Okay, I think some of the obstacles are really because this is a whole shift. It's a whole shift in mindset. You know, it really is a full paradigm shift to shift from thinking about crime and punishment to thinking about harm and repairing harm. And that some people, teachers, sometimes to people in criminal justice, they feel like there has to be consequences. And the fact is that no matter what you do, there's natural and logical consequences to everything you do. So, so you can learn, you can use those consequences that are already going to happen to help people to kind of understand. But I think the barriers are, one time after a homicide at Beach Street Project, the director called me. I work on a homicide support services project, and that used to be the old LAMP program at Rox Comp. And they called me to have a circle. And we talked, and we were going to have a resident circle, and then we were going to train residents. We had the dates set all up and everything to train residents. And then the director went to a HUD meeting in Washington and came back and said, they told me I can't do it. So I think that liability gets in the way sometimes for people too. And yet, look at the prices that we're paying. I mean, look at the liability to our communities already. So, yeah. I think that there are, you know, all the traps, all the setups, you know. I like, there's a phrase that says, upset the setup, you know. And I think that's what we have to do, is upset the setups. I think that all of the setups are meant to keep some people down. And that when you start talking about freedom and you start talking about people being equal and everybody having value to contribute, that scares people.
No, I want to piggyback on that. So, just telling you a little bit about my past. Every obstacle that he's talking about and she's talking about, I experience on a daily basis. You know, they tell you, serve your time, come out, be productive. And somebody said to me, they said, Christian, look, it's one thing if you get out and tell brothers to be good within the system as it exists. It's totally different if you're telling these young men that they are worth something to the point that they can be holding the jobs to help facilitate the process of bringing these circles to where they need to be. There's a big problem where we put money towards glamorizing the problem. That's what this really comes down to. We glamorize the problem. We paint it so pretty that you just fear everything that comes with it. We need to be empowering young people at the core levels about self-empowerment, self-value. The real circle starts with the circle within yourself, and then it goes outward. It doesn't come from the top down. Cure doesn't come from the top down. Only Band-Aids do. So that's just to.
Yeah. Let me take a few questions, and then we'll let our panelists comment, because I think we're running a little bit low on time. So can I hear from a few folks, and maybe we can jot down, the questions as they're going. You want to start in back with Shino?
Hello. Thank you for your great opportunity. My name is Shino. I'm a PhD student in global governance in human security and conflict resolution. And I actually attended the Restorative Justice workshop. And I was actually in the same group with Mother Janet in MCI Shirley. I was very impressed by your talk, but maybe it's not relevant to what you were talking about, but I have a question related to gender. Because when I went to the male prison, and even here, people are talking about a lot of male prisoner, and restorative justice seems to be introduced to as a means to restore, like, I don't know, the value inside within the male inmates. But do you think it's also can be applied to female inmates? I don't know, like, because we take it for granted that a lot of violent criminals is committed by like a male, but it's not really the case. And can restorative justice be applied to female inmates? And have you ever had such an opportunity? This is my question.
Yes, it absolutely can. It can be applied to any human being. And there are 3 people right over there who are going into Framingham Prison very soon to do it. So, yeah.
Okay, a couple more questions before we finish. We want to hear from... No? Okay, Sadia, please.
So you guys can hear me, right? So first, thank you for your testimony, for each of you. You know, the title of this talk was kind of community responses to violence, and I'm thinking about... Hello? Yeah, there we go. I'm thinking about sort of community responses to violence, and one of the things I'm sometimes struggle with sort of this phrase community responses, what are, in your opinion, sort of the physical spaces in which that community actually exists? So when we're talking about involving the community, what are the sort of tangible steps that people can take? What are those spaces?
Okay. One last question. Did anyone have to want to add to the... Okay, great. Please.
My question is, if you could, Christian, if you could go back and only teach one skill that you learned through the circle processes to your younger self, which would you pick? What would be the first one you would want to teach your younger self?
Okay, great. So I want to invite the panelists to comment on any of these questions that you've heard, but also perhaps you heard things that each other said during the presentations. Perhaps you may want to, and we'll make these your final comments, okay? Janet, do you want to start, and we'll go just this direction, or?
She's had a lot of pressure to start first today. I don't know what was going on.
Well, I don't remember what the questions were. I'm 69 years old. I didn't write them down.
What are some of the tangible physical spaces that...
The physical spaces, I think, we look at where are community spaces. Where do people hold meetings now? Where do there's churches, there's community centers, there's, there's Hibernia Hall. There's all kinds of places where people can come together. There's, the First Church of Roxbury. There's the First Church of Dorchester. There's all kinds of churches where people come together all the time for circles and stuff. There's one man, Sam Williams, who holds a circle for for men at a dojo in Jamaica Plain. So, you know, I think that there are spaces. You just have to look around for them. You don't even have to look that hard. There are spaces. And I think that community to me, I mean, I grew up in Dorchester. I've lived in Dorchester all my life, but community to me is not just about geography. It's about a sense of belonging. It's about people coming together. It's about people believing in one another and supporting one another and sharing common values and exploring those values together.
I'll keep following along in that vein. Community, to me, involves the people making the decisions, the politicians, and the people who are actually pulling the triggers, and everybody in between. I met with a city councilwoman not too long ago, and she asked me, what is the first thing I can do to be able to begin to bridge the gap from City Hall to, say, Humboldt Ave? And I said, the first thing we need to do is redefine community to include everybody. So to specifically to answer you, the circles are going to be in different places, and people have to be willing to go to every place. They need to be having circles in City Hall. It's one community. I think that that's what people tend to forget. It's one community we're talking about. It's just further subdivided into many different things because there's different issues that affect different people at different times. But it's one community. It's one body. I could be having a circle on the middle of Humboldt Ave. She could be having it in the prison. He can be having it in the church. But our kids are all going to come across each other. And that's what that's what we need to get back to, is that community being one community. To answer the young lady's question specifically, I wouldn't say anything. I would listen to myself. Nobody listened to me. You have one.
I just want to say again, thanks for people taking the time to keep wrestling with this. On some levels, not only challenging, but sometimes depressing issue. But I think it's our willingness to do that is critical to making change and making progress. And I'm especially grateful to the mothers who are here, Janet, because they have lost so much, but have determined that those losses in some way are really going to produce a different result. I ran across a story of a psychiatrist who's known for a lot of the work that he did in the realm of suicide, and a mother came to talk to him about the tremendous pain that she felt in the loss of her child. And his first response was, whatever you do, don't waste that grief. And I'm grateful for people who have had tremendous grief, but have chosen not to waste it. And have, in the process, helped all of us, I think, really try to diminish the numbers of people wrestling through that same grief. So my special thanks to the mothers who are here.
Okay, well, I'd like to, I think this is just, this was an amazing evening. I want to put a special thanks to our panelists who really just raised the conversation to a level that we just can't have. Of course, to District Attorney Rachael Rollins. I'd really like to thank Legacy Lives On. We didn't get a chance, thank you for coming. We didn't get a chance to have you meet in small groups, but we really want to have you come back again and talk more about your work as well. So we want to talk about that. So my thanks to all of you, and thanks again to the Slomoff family for making all of this possible. Good night, and thanks again. All right.